Now I'd love to dive into a bonus topic, the topic of chief learning officers. So, what is a CLO? What do you do? And when do you bring on a CLO as a startup in edtech?
Okay, so confusingly, there are two types of CLO. There's a chief learning officer who sits in a big corporate organization and looks after the learning and development of the employees in that business. And then there's a different kind of chief learning officer, the kind that I was at Busuu, who is much more concerned with learning outcomes and learning science and is the guardian of the learning experience of the customer. So when I started at Busuu, I was the head of education. We were a smaller company then, had a smaller C-suite, probably didn't need someone with the clout of a chief learning officer. And also importantly at that time, I didn't have what I now have, which is a master's in applied linguistics from Oxford University. So I actually studied that during my time at Busuu. So I became more qualified and more experienced in the learning sciences during my journey. As head of education, I was essentially doing the same job, but I was much more focused on scaling up content production, building the learning design team, developing the learning methodology. When I became the chief learning officer, I got involved in more externally facing work where I was sharing the learning methodology at academic conferences. I was taking part in academic research projects with third parties. I was working more strategically on how do we embed machine learning into our courses? Where should we be going in the future with our learning? What's our overall learning methodology and strategy for things like assessment, for example? So it became more outward facing, a little bit more theoretical.
And as an edtech company, when do you bring on that type of CLO that focuses on the learning science side of things?
Interestingly, I talk to a lot of edtech startup founders, and I'm finding that a lot of them who have very content or learning focused businesses are bringing on content and learning specialists far too late in the journey. There's a tendency in ed tech startups for people to focus on the tech first or to get excited about the tech and forget that for the customer, what they're there to do is learn. And the majority of the time they spend in your product, they are learning something. And if you don't bring on content, learning design, learning science expertise early and make that a core part of your leadership team and your strategy, you're going to struggle later on. And you may find that you struggle with things like retention. You may start to get negative customer feedback because you can have the most exciting, brilliant technology. But if people aren't feeling the learning outcomes, if they're not feeling that strong sense of progress, they're not going to stick with you. And you may also struggle to raise investment rounds in the future because as you grow in stature as an ed tech business, investors will start caring much more about learning outcomes. They will want you to be able to demonstrate them. And they will want to see that rigor and seriousness in your leadership team. You don't necessarily need to have a chief learning officer at the beginning, but if you're an ed tech business and you have a CTO and a CPO, you should be asking yourself whether you also need a CLO. Because if learning is what your customers are looking for, you need someone representing them in your leadership team.
Let's go back a little bit in the stage before you've got a CTO, CPO, perhaps. What do you do when you're at the very early stages, but you want to bake in the learning from day one? How do you do that without a full-time CLO?
The great thing about edtech startups today, and this was not true 8 years ago when I started at Busuu, is there are now lots of really qualified learning designers, really experienced learning designers out there in the market. When I started, learning designer wasn't really a thing. I had to take teachers and train them myself to become instructional designers, learning designers. That is not the case now. There are tons of people who've worked at different edtech startups, designing learning, building learning. Many of those people have master's or PhD level qualifications as well. So they're out there, these people, and you don't have to hire a permanent employee, but you can certainly hire a contractor. You can hire someone part-time. There's a lot of good people out there on the market. You're not necessarily going to find the right person straight away, but you're certainly going to have an easier time of it today than you would have done 8 years ago.